So this presentation is having a look at some of the key changes in ISO 9001-2015 and IATF 16949-2016 affecting an organisation's supplier management process. My name is Paul Hardiman, Director of Quality Partner. I've been working with quality management systems for 25 years and I'm an IATF witness auditor and trainer. So in looking at the changes in the supplier management process, we're going to take a look at the turtle diagram, starting with the inputs to the process. So what could be the inputs? We need to think about, are there any customer directed sources? So the customer may direct that we have to buy material from a particular source, but we can't just wash our hands and say, okay, that's nothing to do with us. On an ongoing basis, we need to make sure that those customer directed sources are capable of meeting the requirements to supply the product that we need to make a conforming product. Then we need to think about customer specific requirements. Customers will have specific requirements related to supplier selection and supplier development. So it's important that we understand those customer specific requirements. We need to think about what existing suppliers do we have and how do we go about selecting new suppliers of products, of processes and services. So this, I think, is an expanded requirement. Many of us, I think, when we thought about supplier management, primarily we focus upon suppliers that are supplying the product or the raw materials. Now we need to expand that thinking to think about suppliers of processes, which may be outsourced processes, and suppliers of services. We also need to think about clearly understanding statutory and regulatory requirements and communicating the relevant statutory and regulatory requirements to our suppliers. So this may be an input in from our sales process, may be an input in from our design and development process to make sure that we understand the relevant statutory and regulatory requirements. We also need to understand from sales and from design any requirements for embedded software that we need to go out and procure. We need to understand the customer requirements related to that embedded software because we need to communicate those relevant requirements down through the supply base. So now let's have a think about the output of the supplier management process. So what we need as an output is suppliers that are meeting the customer requirements, meeting any interested party requirements, and meeting our own organisation requirements. So that's going to make sure that we have a good process for how we go about selecting a new supplier and also how we go about supplier quality management system development for our existing suppliers. This has always been inferred in ISO TS 16949, but now we see a much more structured process and set of requirements related to this. So let's have a look now at the defined supplier development process defined in ISO TS 16949. So the base requirement is that suppliers have certification to ISO 9001 by a third-party certification body. So this is the expected norm. If we have key suppliers that don't have ISO 9001, then at minimum we need to do a second-party audit of those suppliers using a qualified second-party auditor. But what we're looking for as part of supplier development is we're trying to develop those suppliers towards formal certification for ISO 9001. The next phase is that even if a supplier has got ISO 9001, that we're looking now to further develop that supplier, maybe using some of the documents that are specified in customer specific requirements. So one of those is an example of a requirement that's specified by Ford and by Chrysler, which is MAQ MSR. Now I see this document as a halfway house between ISO 9001 and IATF 16949. So this may be something that we could use as a second-party audit document to try and move an ISO 9001 supplier forward. So for example, in these minimum automotive requirements, it will require the supplier to have FMEAs, require the supplier to have control plans, require the supplier to do measurement system analysis, require the supplier to do statistical process control and statistical analysis of their processes. That's all defined in this customer document called MAQ MSR. But this is only an example. But this phase of supply development is using structured supply development to try and move organisations towards the goal of compliance to IATF 16949. The next thing is we could develop the supplier that they are still fully compliant with 9001 and they're compliant with IATF 16949, and we've validated that through doing a second party audit using qualified second party auditors. So this is the next stage in the supply development process. The final stage is certification to ISO 9001 and IATF 16949. So the ultimate goal should be that all of our suppliers that are applicable for IATF 16949 are compliant with the requirements. But that is a long-term goal. Maybe there is no time scale to that, but what we've got to show in every audit that we have a structured supplier development process moving suppliers forward using this very structured approach. And obviously we should be prioritizing supplier development. In doing this, we're looking at supplier performance, we're looking at second party audit findings, we're looking at the third party certification status, and we're also taking into consideration the risk. For example, we may have some key single source suppliers that it is imperative that have good systems to make sure they can provide ongoing supply. So this is much stronger now in IATF 16949 that we have a very structured supply development process. So let's think about the results of supplier management. What results are we trying to achieve? Well, obviously we want supplier conformance to the requirements. So we want suppliers to provide products that are to the quality requirements that we've defined that also meet applicable regulatory requirements. We want to minimize supplier disruptions so we can minimize customer disruptions. So we should be monitoring customer disruptions that have been caused by supplier issues. We should obviously continue to monitor supplier delivery schedule performance, making sure that suppliers are delivering on time so they're not then causing any disruptions with our ability to meet the customer requirements. And finally, we need to be monitoring occurrences of premium freight. In the previous standard, it talked about incidents. Here we now talk about that we have to monitor the occurrences of premium freight that have been caused by a supplier. So now let's take a look at the how part of the turtle diagram. So first of all, we have to have documented processes for how we go about selecting a new supplier, including assessment of risk. So some of you may already be familiar with VDA 6.3. Within VDA 6.3 there is a system called potential analysis, and we could use this for selecting a new supplier. This is not mandated unless you're supplying one of the German vehicle makers, but I think is a very good structured system for selecting a new supplier. But irrespective of that, if we don't use VDA 6.3, we need to define in a documented process how we go about selecting a new supplier and how we take into account risk. We need to continue to ensure that we've got adequate controls for any processes that we outsource. And this is not just manufacturing processes. For example, we may outsource aspects of the IT process, the security process, the maintenance process. We need to make sure we've got adequate control of any outsourced process that can affect customer requirements. We need to continue to ensure that we meet compliance to any statutory or regulatory requirements related to any purchased product. And finally, we have to have a documented process for how we're going to evaluate and monitor supplier performance. These don't all need to be separate documented processes, but somewhere within our quality management system, these have to be documented. So now let's take a look at the with who part of the turtle diagram. One of the key additions in IATF 16949 is making sure that we have within our supplier management process that we have access to competent second-party auditors. So this was not specifically mentioned in ISO TS 16949. So these second-party auditors must be fully competent in the automotive process approach. They must be competent in risk-based thinking. They must be competent in the customer and organisation customer-specific requirements. They must fully understand the ISO 9001-2015 and IATF 16949-2016 requirements. They must understand the core tools relevant to the scope of the audit, and they must have adequate auditing skills. They must know how to plan an audit, undertake an audit, report an audit, and then help develop the supplier by doing follow-up audits to verify the effectiveness of any supplier continual improvement activities. So, whereas you may have competent second-party auditors, you need to make sure that they do meet all of these requirements. So let's summarise the changes. So the scope now of supplier management covers not only externally provided products, but also products and services. This is led by the change in ISO 9001-2015. So it's got a much broader requirement. There's far more specific requirements about supplier selection, including how do we understand the risk in selecting a new supplier. I think there's far more focus in selecting and monitoring outsourced processes. This seems to be a key feature within the automotive industry, that outsourcing is a thing of the current and the future. Within IATF 16949, the question has been asked, do we effectively manage those outsourced processes? I think one of the fundamental changes is a far more structured process for supplier development. You've seen in my presentation this very structured approach to how we should go through step-by-step supplier development. So we need to make sure that supplier development is documented in a documented process. And finally, what I've just mentioned is the competency requirements for second-party auditors. If we're sending out people to audit and develop our suppliers, we need to make sure that those people have got the relevant skills. So in summary, I think this process, supplier management, is one of the key challenges in making a successful transition. That we really do focus upon the impact of these changes, but also within supplier management, a fundamental thing is risk-based thinking.